In the fading light of an autumn afternoon, a dedicated teacher stands alone in her empty classroom, cardboard box in hand. Sarah Mitchell's 20-year career at Lincoln Middle School ends not with celebration, but with a termination notice. Her crime? Using her own money to help a struggling student afford textbooks and lunch. As she places her last personal item in the box, a small potted plant her students gave her, she has no way of knowing that her act of kindness has set larger forces in motion. In less than 24 hours, a fleet of black limousines will arrive at Lincoln Middle School, and the true impact of her sacrifice will be revealed in ways she never imagined. What happens when one teacher's compassion collides with unexpected power and influence? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning bell at Lincoln Middle School rang with its familiar metallic clarity as Sarah Mitchell adjusted the crooked class photo on her wall. 20 years of similar photos lined the classroom, each capturing a moment in time, each face telling its own story. Her fingers lingered on last year's photo, touching the worn wooden frame that her first class had given her, back when her hair was darker and her idealism fresher. The photo reminded her of simpler times before budget cuts, and standardized testing had begun reshaping the landscape of public education. She straightened her cardigan, bought second-hand but still professional, and turned to face her empty classroom. 32 desks arranged in neat rows waited for their occupants. Some wobbled on uneven legs, others bore the scratches and scars of countless students, but Sarah had arranged them with mathematical precision, as she did every morning. She pulled out her lesson planner, its pages dog-eared and filled with careful annotations. Red ink marked the spots where she needed to adjust for students who required extra attention, blue ink for those who needed more challenges. Teaching wasn't just about following a curriculum. It was about knowing each student's story, their struggles, their potential. The first students began trickling in, their voices echoing off the institutional green walls. Sarah greeted each one by name, noting Jamie's new glasses, Michael's tired eyes, Rebecca's proud smile as she clutched a book report. 20 years of teaching had taught her to read these subtle signs, to see past the surface to what lay beneath. "Good morning, Mrs. Mitchell," they chorused, some enthusiastic, others still shaking off sleep. She smiled, remembering how her own 7th-grade teacher, Mrs. Henderson, had made her feel seen and valued. Now she carried that torch, trying to be the teacher every student deserved. The morning sunlight filtered through windows that hadn't been properly cleaned in months, another casualty of budget cuts. Sarah had offered to clean them herself, but the janitor, Mr. Rodriguez, wouldn't hear of it. "You already do too much, Mrs. M," he'd said, promising to get to them when he could. She understood. Like her, he was trying to do more with less. Opening her bottom desk drawer, Sarah pulled out her emergency supplies. Granola bars, spare pencils, a few basic calculators, all purchased with her own money, all necessary for those students who came unprepared, not through laziness, but through circumstance. Her salary barely covered her own living expenses, but she couldn't bear to see a child go hungry or feel embarrassed about not having basic supplies. The final bell rang, and Sarah closed her drawer, surveying her now full classroom. 30 faces looked back at her, each carrying their own hopes, fears, and dreams. Some came from comfortable homes with well-stocked study areas, others from places where dinner wasn't guaranteed. But here, in room 237, she tried to level the playing field as much as she could. "Today," she began, her voice carrying to the back of the room, "we're going to explore something fascinating." She pulled down the world map, its edges curling slightly with age. "We're going to learn about how different cultures around the world have used mathematics to solve everyday problems." As she spoke, she noticed a few students perk up, especially those who usually struggled with traditional math lessons. This was why she spent her weekends researching alternative teaching methods, finding ways to make abstract concepts concrete and relatable. It meant less sleep and more work, but the light of understanding in a student's eyes made it worthwhile. Her hand brushed against the frame of another class photo as she walked between the desks. This one, from 10 years ago, featured a girl named Maria, who had started the year barely speaking English and ended it giving a presentation on geometric patterns in traditional Mexican art. Maria still sent her Christmas cards, now writing from medical school. These were the moments that sustained her through the tough times, through budget meetings where she fought for basic supplies, through nights spent grading papers at her kitchen table, through mornings when her ancient car barely started. Teaching wasn't just her profession, it was her calling. As she guided her students through the lesson, Sarah's mind drifted briefly to her own struggles. Her rent had gone up again, and her sister had gently suggested looking for work in the private school system. "They pay better," Jenny had said over Sunday dinner, "and you wouldn't have to buy supplies for your students." But Sarah knew she belonged here, in this public school classroom, where some students needed her most. Her mother had always told her that wealth wasn't just about money, it was about what you gave to others. Looking at her students' engaged faces, Sarah knew she was rich in ways that mattered most. The morning continued with its familiar rhythm. Questions asked and answered, small victories celebrated, occasional disruptions handled with patient firmness. Each moment was a thread in the tapestry of learning she worked to weave every day, hoping it would be strong enough to support her students through whatever challenges lay ahead. The first time Sarah noticed Marcus Reynolds, he was hunched over a tattered science textbook during lunch period, carefully copying pages into a spiral notebook. Most students fled the classroom the moment the lunch bell rang, but Marcus stayed, working with quiet determination. The book wasn't even from her class. It was a borrowed copy from the school library, missing its back cover and several crucial chapters. Sarah watched him from her desk, pretending to grade papers while observing. How he squinted at the smudged diagrams, his pencil moving with careful precision. No lunch bag sat on his desk, no brown paper sack or plastic container, just the borrowed book and his well-worn notebook. "That's some dedicated studying," she said finally, breaking the silence. Marcus startled, his pencil leaving a dark streak across the page. "Sorry, I didn't mean to surprise you." "It's okay, Mrs. Mitchell." His voice was soft but clear. I need to copy these pages before someone else checks out the book. There's a waiting list." Sarah moved closer, noting how the boy's uniform shirt was carefully pressed, despite being visibly worn at the cuffs. Everything about Marcus spoke of care, taken with limited resources. She recognized the signs. She'd seen them before in other students, and if she was honest, in her own childhood memories. Why copy by hand? We have a copier in the library. She already suspected the answer, but she wanted to hear it from him. Marcus's shoulders tensed slightly. "The copies cost 50 cents per page, and there's—" He paused, counting in his head. "About 30 pages I need. $15. Not much to some, but Sarah knew better than to judge what might be a significant sum to a family. She glanced at his notebook, seeing neat, careful handwriting and surprisingly accurate diagrams. This wasn't just busy work. The boy was teaching himself. "You know," she said carefully, "I might have some old science textbooks from previous years. They're not the current edition, but the basic principles haven't changed much." It wasn't strictly true. She'd need to buy the book. But something about Marcus's quiet determination moved her. His eyes lit up before he caught himself, schooling his expression back to careful neutrality. "That would be, if it's not too much trouble." "No trouble at all." Sarah returned to her desk, jotting down the book's title and ISBN. She'd stopped by the used bookstore on her way home. "But Marcus, you should eat something during lunch break. The brain needs fuel to learn." A flash of something. Embarrassment? Worry crossed his face. "I'm not really hungry," he said, but his stomach chose that moment to growl softly, betraying him. Sarah opened her desk drawer, pulling out one of her emergency granola bars. Here, brain food. Can't have one of my best students running on empty. She placed it on his desk casually, as if sharing snacks with students was an everyday occurrence. Marcus stared at the granola bar for a long moment before carefully unwrapping one end. He broke it precisely in half, offering a portion back. To her, the gesture, so automatic, spoke volumes about his character. "You keep it," she smiled. "I already ate." Another small lie, but one she could live with. Over the next few weeks, Sarah noticed more details about Marcus. How he never had a textbook of his own, instead borrowing from the library or sharing with classmates. How he wore the same 3 shirts in careful rotation, each one clean but showing signs of age. How he never complained, never made excuses, just worked twice as hard to keep up. His test scores were consistently high, showing a natural aptitude for mathematics and science that reminded Sarah of herself at that age. But where she had had parents who could provide basic school supplies, Marcus seemed to be navigating the system alone. She began leaving granola bars on his desk before class, presenting them as rewards for good work. Sometimes she'd accidentally pack extra lunch, sharing half a sandwich or an apple as they discussed molecular structures or algebraic equations during lunch period. Small gestures, barely noticeable, but she saw how they made a difference. The used science textbook she bought him became his constant companion. She'd seen him carefully covering it with brown paper, adding his own notes in the margins, treating it like a precious possession, which she supposed it was. That evening, Sarah sat at her kitchen table, checkbook open before her, calculator at her side. The numbers didn't lie. Her finances were already stretched thin. Mortgage payment, utilities, car insurance, and the bare necessities left precious. Little wiggle room. The pen hovered over her check register as she contemplated the balance. A memory surfaced. Herself at 12, wearing hand-me-down clothes, watching her mother count out coins for school supplies. "We'll make it work," her mother had always said, somehow finding a way to provide what was needed. Now, decades later, Sarah found herself echoing those words in her empty kitchen. She pulled out the list she'd been compiling. Textbooks for Marcus's core subjects, a scientific calculator, a proper lunch plan. The total made her wince, but she couldn't shake the image of him carefully copying those textbook pages, breaking his single granola bar in half to share. The phone rang, interrupting her calculations. It was Jenny, her sister. "You missed Sunday dinner," Jenny said without preamble. "Mom was worried," Sarah sighed, realizing she'd lost track of days again. "I'm sorry. I was grading papers and working too hard as usual," Jenny finished. "Sarah, when was the last time you did something for yourself? That private school offer is still open, you know. Better pay, better resources." "I can't, Jenny. My students need me here. Your students need you to take care of yourself too." A pause. "Are you still buying supplies for your class?" Sarah glanced guiltily at her checkbook. "Sometimes they need help." "You're not responsible for fixing the whole system," Jenny said softly. "Dad would say you're taking on too much." Their father had been a practical man, an accountant who believed in careful planning and living within one's means. What would he think of her now, about to stretch her budget even thinner for a student she barely knew? "I remember when Mrs. Henderson helped me," Sarah said finally. "Remember, when I needed that graphing calculator for advanced math? That was different. She just loaned you one." "No," Sarah corrected. "I found out years later she bought it specifically for me. She never asked for it back." Silence on the line. They both remembered Mrs. Henderson, how she'd changed Sarah's trajectory with that simple act of kindness. One teacher, one decision, one student at a time. Wasn't that how real change happened? After hanging up, Sarah returned to her calculations. She could cut back on her own groceries, skip her weekly coffee splurge, maybe pick up some weekend tutoring. Small sacrifices that could make a real difference in one student's life. The next morning, she arrived at school early, a plastic shopping, a bag tucked discreetly in her bottom drawer. She'd started with the essentials, a complete set of textbooks, carefully chosen from the used bookstore but still in good condition. A scientific calculator, bought on sale but perfect for the advanced math Marcus clearly had the aptitude for, and a packed lunch, nothing fancy, but nutritious. When Marcus arrived for first period, she called him to her desk. "I found these. In storage," she said, the lie tasting bitter but necessary. "They're older editions, but still perfectly good. And this calculator, well, I won't be teaching advanced math this year, so it's just gathering dust. Would you be able to use them?" She watched his face carefully, saw the flash of longing quickly masked by pride. I couldn't," he started. "They'll just go to waste otherwise," she said firmly. "Consider it a long-term loan. When you're finished with them, you can pass them on to another student who needs them." That did it. The idea of helping others, of being part of a chain of giving rather than just receiving, seemed to ease his hesitation. He carefully gathered the books, handling them like precious artifacts. "Thank you, Mrs. Mitchell," he said quietly, and in those 4 words she heard everything he wasn't saying. "One more thing," she added, pulling out the lunch bag. "I'm trying this new meal planning system, but I keep making too much. Would you help me out by taking the extras? Otherwise, they'll just go to waste." This time his smile reached his eyes. They both knew it was a fiction, this careful dance around pride and necessity, but it was a fiction that preserved dignity while meeting needs. As Marcus returned to his desk, Sarah watched him carefully place each book in his backpack. She thought of her checkbook at home, the careful calculations, and small sacrifices ahead. Worth it, she decided. Some things didn't need to balance perfectly on paper to be absolutely right. The changes in Marcus were subtle at first, like watching a flower slowly turn toward the sun. His shoulders straightened, no longer hunched under the weight of constant worry. His hand began to rise more frequently during class discussions, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. Each correct answer, each completed assignment, added a small brick to the foundation of his self-assurance. Sarah kept a private folder in her desk, documenting his progress. His first test after receiving the textbooks showed a marked improvement, from a B to an A. But it was more than just grades. His lab reports now included detailed diagrams, made possible by having time to study the material properly instead of rushing to copy borrowed books. "Marcus is doing remarkably well," Sarah mentioned to Mrs. Donovan, the science teacher, during lunch break in the faculty lounge. "His understanding of molecular structures is really advanced for his age." "I've noticed," Mrs. Donovan agreed, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. "He submitted an extra credit project last week that could have been high school level work. Whatever you're doing in your math class seems to be helping across the board." Sarah just nodded, saying nothing about the real reason for the improvement. The textbooks remained their secret, along with the daily lunches she packed. Marcus had taken to leaving thank-you notes tucked into the empty lunch containers, small sketches of mathematical concepts they'd discussed, or interesting science facts he'd learned. One morning, she found a particularly detailed drawing of a DNA helix, carefully labeled and annotated. At the bottom, he'd written, "Did you know that humans share 50% of their DNA with bananas? Thanks for yesterday's lunch, even though it didn't include any bananas." The joke, small as it was, marked another kind of progress. Marcus was beginning to show his personality, to trust that it was safe to be more than just the quiet, hard-working student in the back of the room. Other teachers began to notice too. Mr. Phillips, the English teacher, stopped her in the hallway one afternoon. "That Reynolds kid in your homeroom, he's really coming out of his shell. Actually led the class discussion on The Giver yesterday. Talked about the parallels between rationed food in the book and real-world resource distribution. Pretty deep stuff for a 7th grader." Sarah felt a warm glow of pride, tempered by a constant undercurrent of worry. Every time she wrote another check for supplies or prepared another lunch, she knew she was bending, if not breaking, school rules about personal involvement with students. but watching Marcus thrive made it impossible to regret her choice. During their lunch sessions, which had become a regular occurrence, Marcus began sharing more about his life. Never complaining, just matter-of-fact statements dropped between bites of sandwich or mathematical equations. "Mum's really busy with work," he said one day, solving a complex algebra problem. "She travels a lot, but she always calls to check my homework when she can." Sarah nodded, reading between the lines. A single mother working hard to provide, perhaps not always aware of what her son might need for school. She thought of her own mother, how she'd worked 2 jobs, but still somehow made it to every parent-teacher conference. The autumn weeks slipped, marked by small victories. Marcus joined the science club, his new calculator enabling him to participate fully in their projects. He started helping other students during study periods, sharing his growing confidence along with his knowledge. Each step forward reinforced Sarah's conviction that she'd made the right choice. One particularly memorable moment came during a parent-teacher conference night. Marcus's mother couldn't attend, something about an unavoidable business meeting. But Sarah took extra time to document his progress anyway. She created a portfolio of his work, showing the steady improvement in his grades, the increasing complexity of his projects, the growing sophistication of his analytical skills. She'd send it home with him, she decided, along with a note about his emerging leadership qualities. His mother should know that her son was flourishing, even if she couldn't be there to see it firsthand. That evening, organizing the portfolio, at her desk, Sarah found another note from Marcus tucked inside his latest assignment. "Thank you for believing in me," it said simply. Below the words was a complex geometric pattern, each angle precisely measured, creating a beautiful symmetrical design. She pinned it carefully to her bulletin board next to 20 years' worth of student artwork and thank you notes. But this one was different. This one represented not just gratitude, but transformation, proof that sometimes the right help at the right moment could change everything. The first hint of trouble came on a Wednesday afternoon, when Sarah noticed Ms. Winters, the new vice principal, lingering outside her classroom during lunch period. Through the narrow window in the door, she could see the administrator's sharp gaze fixed on Marcus, who was working through advanced math problems while eating his packed lunch. Sarah's heart skipped a beat, but she kept her voice steady as she explained a particularly challenging equation. Years of teaching had taught her to maintain composure, even when anxiety threatened to overtake her. She waited until Marcus had packed up his things and left for his next class before stepping into the hallway. "Sarah," Miss Winter's voice was coolly professional. "Do you have a moment?" The vice principal's office was meticulously organized, every file perfectly aligned, every surface spotless. Sarah sat in one of the straight-backed chairs, noting how the afternoon light cast harsh shadows across the desk between them. "I've received some concerns," Ms. Winters began, adjusting her wire-rimmed glasses, "about your relationship with Marcus Reynolds." The words hung in the air like frost. Sarah forced herself to maintain eye contact, though her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Marcus is an exceptional student who seems to have acquired a full set of new textbooks," Ms. Winters interrupted, "and who regularly spends lunch periods in your classroom, eating food that you provide." She opened a folder on her desk. Mrs. Peterson noticed the books in his locker during hall duty. She was quite surprised, given that she'd seen Marcus using library copies just a few weeks ago. Sarah's mind raced. Mrs. Peterson, the 7th-grade English teacher who'd been passed over for department head last year. Of course, she'd be the one to notice, to report. "The books were surplus copies," Sarah said carefully, the practice lie feeling heavier now. "As for lunch, sometimes students prefer a quiet place to study." "Mrs. Mitchell," Ms. Winter's voice sharpened. "We both know there were no surplus textbooks. The district's budget cuts have been quite thorough." She leaned forward. "Did you purchase those books yourself?" Sarah thought of Marcus's careful notes, his improving grades, his growing confidence. I don't see how that's relevant to... It's extremely relevant. Ms. Winters tapped her pen against the desk. District policy strictly prohibits teachers from providing personal financial assistance to students. It creates liability issues, sets inappropriate precedents, and can be seen as showing favoritism. Favoritism? Sarah couldn't keep the edge from her voice. Is that what we're calling it when we help a student who needs basic supplies to learn? There are proper channels for addressing student needs, forms that can be filed, committees that can review cases, forms that take months to process. Sarah interrupted. Committees that meet once a semester. Meanwhile, students like Marcus fall behind, not because they lack ability, but because they lack resources. Ms. Winters' expression hardened. Your idealism is admirable, Sarah, but rules exist for a reason. What happens when other students notice? When their parents start asking why some children receive special treatment while others don't? Special treatment. Sarah leaned forward. We're talking about textbooks and lunch. Basic necessities. We're talking about boundaries. Ms. Winters closed the folder with a decisive snap. I'm giving you a verbal warning. Document Marcus's needs through proper channels and cease providing personal assistance immediately. If this continues, I'll have no choice but to escalate the matter. Sarah stood, her chair scraping against the floor. And Marcus, what happens to him while we wait for proper channels? That's not your concern. Miss Winters' tone made it clear the discussion was over. You're his teacher, Mrs. Mitchell, not his parent, not his provider. Remember that. Walking back to her classroom, Sarah's mind churned with worry. She thought of Marcus's face when she'd first given him the textbooks, the quiet pride in his voice when he'd aced his last test. The idea of taking it all away, of watching him struggle again while bureaucratic wheels turned slowly, made her physically ill. At her desk, she found a folded paper airplane, one of Marcus's origami creations. Inside, he'd written out a complex equation they'd discussed earlier with a note, "Finally figured it out. Thanks for helping me see it differently." Sarah touched the careful creases in the paper, thinking about Ms. Winters' words. Boundaries, proper channels, rules that existed for a reason. But what was the reason worth, she wondered, if it meant watching a bright mind dim, a eager spirit diminish? She opened her desk drawer, looking at the lunch she'd packed for tomorrow. A simple sandwich, an apple, a small bag of carrots. Such a small thing, really. Such an easy way to help. How could something so right be considered so wrong? The formal letter arrived in Sarah's mailbox on a Saturday morning. Notice of administrative review, read the header in stark black letters. Below it, clinical language outlined the investigation into her inappropriate allocation of personal resources and violation of professional boundaries. She read it 3 times at her kitchen table, coffee growing cold beside her. The word investigation felt especially heavy, as if she'd committed some terrible crime instead of trying to help a student succeed. Through her window, she could see her neighbors' children playing in their yard, their laughter a stark contrast to the weight settling in her chest. Monday morning brought a different atmosphere to her classroom. News of the investigation had spread through the faculty grapevine, creating invisible barriers. In the teacher's lounge, conversations stopped when she entered. Mrs. Peterson studiously avoided eye contact, while others offered awkward smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. Only Mrs. Donovan, the science teacher, dared to speak openly, with her during lunch break. "The whole thing is ridiculous," she muttered, sliding into the chair beside Sarah's desk. 20 years of exemplary teaching, and they're investigating you for buying books. It's shameful." Sarah managed a weak smile. "They say it sets a dangerous precedent." "Oh, yes. How dangerous?" A teacher actually caring about her students' success. Mrs. Donovan's sarcasm couldn't quite mask her concern. "Have you spoken to the union rep?" "This morning. He says they'll support me, but—" Sarah trailed off, remembering the representative's carefully neutral expression. He also suggested I should cooperate fully with the investigation. The afternoon brought her first interview with the district's review committee. 3 administrators she'd never met sat across a conference table, their faces bearing the blank expressions of those who'd already made up their minds. "Please explain the nature of your relationship with Marcus Reynolds," the committee chair began, her pen poised over a legal pad. Sarah straightened in her chair. "Marcus is a gifted student who showed exceptional promise but lacked basic resources. I provided some assistance to ensure he could participate fully in his education. And you didn't think this created an unfair advantage over other students?" "No," Sarah replied firmly. "I believe what's unfair is watching a capable student struggle unnecessarily when a simple solution exists." "Mrs. Mitchell," another committee member interjected, "are you aware that your actions could be interpreted as criticism of the district's resource allocation?" The question's implicit threat wasn't lost on Sarah. They weren't just investigating her help to Marcus. They were worried about the broader implications, about other teachers following her example, about parents questioning why such help was necessary in the first place. Meanwhile, Marcus had noticed the changing atmosphere. His usual lunchtime visits became hesitant, uncertain. Sarah saw how he watched the door nervously, aware of the increased scrutiny. His test scores remained high, but there was a new tension in his shoulders, a worry in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "Is it true?" he asked one day, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are you in trouble because of me?" "No," Sarah said firmly, her heart breaking at his expression. "Not because of you, never because of you." But the investigation continued, spreading like frost across a window. Each day brought new questions, new forms to fill out, new explanations to provide. How many books had she purchased? What was the total dollar amount? Had she helped other students in similar ways? Did she have receipts, documentation, approval forms? Some of her colleagues began to distance themselves, fear of association outweighing years of friendship. Others offered quiet support. A sympathetic smile, a supportive note, a coffee mysteriously appearing on her desk in the morning. Through it all, Sarah kept teaching. She refused to let the investigation affect her classroom, maintaining her usual enthusiasm even as worry gnawed at her thoughts. Her students, with their uncanny ability to sense adult tension, responded with their own form of support. Better behavior, more engaged discussions, small gestures of appreciation. One morning, she found her classroom door decorated with dozens of paper stars, each bearing a message of gratitude from current and former students. The sight brought tears to her eyes, even as she quickly took them down before administrators could see them. More evidence of inappropriate student attachment, they'd probably say. But in her bottom desk drawer, beneath the remaining granola bars and school supplies, she kept one star. Written in Marcus's careful handwriting, it said simply, "Thank you for teaching me that doing the right thing matters more than doing the easy thing." Sarah touched the star's carefully folded points, thinking about how a single act of kindness could spiral into something so complex, so challenging, and yet so undeniably necessary. The principal's office felt smaller than Sarah remembered. Perhaps it was the presence of the district superintendent, or maybe the thick manila folder centered precisely on Principal Walker's desk. Through the window, she could see students crossing the courtyard, their backpacks bouncing, their lives continuing as normally as ever, while her world prepared to shift on its axis. "Mrs. Mitchell," Superintendent Harris began, his voice carrying the practiced neutrality of someone delivering bad news, "we've completed our review of your case." Sarah nodded, her hands folded quietly in her lap. 20 years of teaching had taught her to maintain composure, even when her heart was racing. She noticed how Principal Walker wouldn't meet her eyes, his gaze fixed on the folder between them. "The committee's findings are quite clear," Harris continued. "Multiple violations of district policy regarding resource allocation and student assistance, unauthorized provision of materials, failure to follow proper channels for student aid requests. He paused, adjusting his glasses, and perhaps most concerning, a pattern of behavior that suggests an unwillingness to recognize these violations. Sarah thought of Marcus, probably sitting in his next class right now, unaware that his world was about to change too. "I recognize the violations," she said quietly. "I simply disagreed with allowing them to prevent a student from learning." Principal Walker winced slightly at her words. They'd worked together for 15 years, and she could see the conflict in his expression, but he remained silent as Harris continued. "Mrs. Mitchell, your dedication to your students is not in question. However, your deliberate circumvention of district policies has left us with no choice. Effective immediately, your employment with Lincoln Middle School is terminated." The words landed like stones in still water, ripples of consequence spreading outward. Sarah had expected this outcome, had prepared herself for it, but the reality still felt surreal. "You'll be provided with the standard severance package," Harris was saying, pushing papers across the desk. "We'll need you to clean out your classroom by the end of the day. A substitute has already been arranged for your classes." "My students," Sarah began, then corrected herself. "The students. Will they be told why?" "They'll be informed that you're leaving for personal reasons." Principal Walker spoke for the first time, his voice carrying a hint of apology. "We see no need to complicate the situation further." Sarah thought of the carefully packed lunch in her desk drawer, waiting for Marcus, of the other students who sometimes came to her for help, for guidance, for a granola bar, or a sympathetic ear. "May I at least say goodbye?" Harris shook his head. "We think it's better for everyone if the transition is handled professionally. You understand?" But she didn't understand. Not really. Not how helping a student succeed could be considered unprofessional. Not how the system they'd built could punish kindness as if it were a crime. She signed the papers mechanically, her signature steady despite her internal turmoil. 20 years of teaching reduced to a few legal documents and a cardboard box. She'd filled with classroom memories. As she stood to leave, Principal Walker finally met her gaze. "Sarah," he said softly, "for what it's worth, I'm sorry it ended this way." "It hasn't ended," she replied, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "Teaching isn't just a job, Tom. It's who I am. That doesn't stop with a termination notice." In her classroom, her former classroom now, Sarah began the painful process of packing up 2 decades of memories. The photos on the walls, the collected thank you notes, the small treasures students had given her over the years. Each item carried its own weight of memory, its own testament to lives touched and lessons shared. She saved Marcus's desk for last. Opening her drawer, she took out the lunch she'd packed that morning and placed it carefully in the center of his desk. Beside it, she left a note. "Dear Marcus, some lessons aren't found in textbooks. Some of the most important things we learn come from staying true to what we believe is right, even when it's difficult. Never stop learning, never stop growing, and never let anyone tell you that you're not worth investing in. Your teacher, Mrs. Mitchell." As she closed her classroom door for the final time, Sarah heard the lunch bell ring. Soon, students would flood these halls, and one boy would find an unexpected message waiting at his desk. She hoped he would understand that this wasn't an ending, but a lesson about standing up for what you believe in, no matter the cost. Walking through the school's main entrance, Sarah held her head high. She might have lost her job, but she hadn't lost her conviction that she'd done the right thing. Sometimes, she reflected, the most important teachings come not from what we say, but from what we're willing to sacrifice for what we believe. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Sarah's now empty classroom, turning familiar corners strange and unfamiliar. The walls, stripped of their posters and student artwork, seemed to echo with 20 years of lessons, laughter, and learning. Even the institutional green paint looked somehow sadder, as if the room itself knew something precious had been lost. Mr. Rodriguez, the janitor, had quietly brought her an extra box when he saw her struggling to fit 2 decades of teaching life into one small container. Now he stood in the doorway, worry etched on his weathered face. "Let me help you carry these to your car, Mrs. M," he offered, reaching for the heaviest box. "Thank you, Carlos." Sarah's voice caught slightly. "But I need to do this myself. One last walk through these halls." He nodded, understanding in his eyes. "What they did, it's not right." Through the open door, Sarah could hear whispers from passing students between classes. Word had spread quickly, despite the administration's attempts at discretion. She caught fragments of conversations. "Mrs. Mitchell's leaving? But why?" "In the middle of the semester." One of her former students, now in 8th grade, hovered at the doorway. "Is it true?" Jenny Martinez asked, her eyes wide with disbelief. "You can't be leaving. You're supposed to teach my sister next year." Sarah set down the photo album she'd been wrapping in bubble wrap. "Sometimes life takes unexpected turns, Jenny, but that doesn't mean the learning stops." More students began, gathering outside her door, their faces a mixture of confusion and distress. Sarah saw Mr. Phillips, the English teacher, trying to hustle them along to their next classes, but his heart didn't seem to be in it. As she packed the last of her personal items, Sarah found things she'd forgotten she had. A dried corsage from the 8th grade graduation dance she'd chaperoned 3 years ago, a coffee mug painted with wobbly flowers by a student who was now in college, a folder of particularly memorable student essays she'd saved over the years. The final bell rang, and Sarah knew Marcus would soon discover her note. She hoped he wouldn't blame himself, wouldn't let this shake his newfound confidence. She had just sealed her last box when Mrs. Donovan burst into the room, practically vibrating with indignation. "This is absurd!" she exclaimed, waving her phone. "Have you seen what's happening on social media? Parents are furious. There's already a petition starting to circulate." Sarah shook her head. "Please don't make this bigger than it needs to be. The students don't need more disruption." "But it needs to be bigger," Mrs. Donovan insisted. "This isn't just about you anymore. It's about what we stand for as educators, about whether we're going to let bureaucracy trump basic human decency." Through the windows, Sarah could see more activity than usual in the parking lot. A local news van had pulled up, and a reporter was setting up a camera. Apparently, someone had tipped off the media. "Sarah." Principal Walker appeared in the doorway, looking uncomfortable. "There are reporters outside. The district's PR team would appreciate it if you'd leave through the back entrance." "Of course they would," Mrs. Donovan muttered. "Heaven forbid anyone see the human cost of their policies." But Sarah was already gathering her boxes. She had no interest in turning this into a media circus. This wasn't about making a statement or proving a point. It had always been about helping one student succeed. As she made her way through the back hallways, she passed the school's trophy case. Among the sports medals and academic awards, she spotted a plaque from 5 years ago, "Teacher of the Year, Sarah Mitchell." The citation praised her dedication to student success and going above and beyond to ensure every child reaches their potential. The irony might have been funny if it hadn't hurt so much. In the back parking lot, her ancient Honda waited faithfully. As she loaded the boxes into her trunk, she heard a familiar voice call out, "Mrs. Mitchell." Marcus stood at the corner of the building, out of breath, as if he'd been running. In his hand, he clutched her note. "You can't leave," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "Not because of me. I'll give the books back. I'll tell them it was my idea." "Marcus," Sarah interrupted gently, "this isn't your fault. Sometimes standing up for what's right has consequences. That doesn't make it any less right." She saw tears in his eyes and wanted desperately to hug him, to tell him everything would be okay. But she knew that would only give the administration more ammunition, more proof that she'd crossed professional boundaries. Instead, she smiled, trying to put all her faith in him into that one expression. "Keep learning, Marcus. Keep growing. That's all I ever wanted." The story broke on social media that evening. Someone, Sarah suspected Mrs. Donovan, had posted a detailed account of what happened, and it spread like wildfire. By midnight, local news stations were running the headline, dedicated teacher, fired for helping struggling student. Sarah sat in her darkened living room, watching her phone light up with notifications until she finally turned it off. Her sister Jenny had already called 3 times, leaving increasingly worried messages. The last one simply said, "Turn on Channel 7 now." The television flickered to life, showing footage of Lincoln Middle School. A crowd of parents and students had gathered outside, holding hastily made signs. "Bring back Mrs. Mitchell," and "Teachers should be allowed to care, and 20 years of service deserves better." The reporter's voiceover was sympathetic. Sources say Sarah Mitchell, a 20-year veteran teacher with an exemplary record, was terminated for providing textbooks and meals to a student in need. The district cites policy violations, but many are questioning whether these policies serve the best interests of students. They cut to an interview with Jenny Martinez's mother, her eyes fierce with protective anger. "Mrs. Mitchell taught both my children. She's the kind of teacher who remembers every student's birthday, who stays late to help anyone struggling, who makes sure every child feels valued. And this is how they thank her." Sarah's hands trembled as she reached for her tea. Gone cold. Hours ago. This wasn't what she'd wanted, this public dissection of what had been a private choice to help one student. She thought of Marcus, hoping he wasn't watching this unfold on the news, hoping he wasn't feeling responsible for the growing controversy. Her email inbox was overflowing with messages from former students, colleagues from other schools, even strangers who'd heard the story. Many shared similar experiences, teachers who'd helped them through difficult times, often in quiet ways that violated some policy or another. One email caught her attention. It was from Maria, the former student now in medical school. "You probably don't remember, but in 10th grade, you bought me a graphing calculator when mine broke and my family couldn't afford a new one. You said it was extra classroom supplies, but I knew. That calculator got me through AP Calculus, then Physics, then my MCAT. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness have the biggest ripples." The story continued to spread overnight. Education. Blogs picked it up, then national news websites. Comment sections filled with heated debates about school funding, teacher autonomy, and the role of educators in students' lives. By morning, Stand with Sarah was trending, alongside Twa Teachers Care and Twa Education Over Policy. Each hashtag carried hundreds of stories, teachers who'd bought supplies, paid for field trips, covered lunch costs, all while trying to navigate the delicate balance between helping students and following rules. Sarah's neighbor, a retired principal, brought over coffee and muffins. "You've started something," she said, settling into Sarah's kitchen chair. "People are asking questions that should have been asked long ago, about why teachers have to choose between following policy and helping students, about why we have these gaps in the first place." "I never wanted to start anything," Sarah sighed, warming her hands around the coffee mug. "I just wanted to help, Marcus. Sometimes that's how the biggest changes start. One person, one choice, one student at a time." A notification popped up on Sarah's laptop. Someone had started a GoFundMe for her. The description read, "Let's show Mrs. Mitchell that her community stands with her. All funds will go to helping her continue her mission of supporting students in need." She quickly closed the laptop. The last thing she wanted was money. What she wanted was to be back in her classroom teaching, helping students understand. Not just mathematics, but the deeper lessons about perseverance, kindness, and standing up for what's right. Her phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Donovan. "You need to see this. Someone posted Marcus's test scores from before and after you started helping him. The improvement is remarkable. People are realizing this isn't just about rules, it's about removing barriers to student success." Sarah thought about Marcus's careful notes, his growing confidence, his willingness to help other students. Those changes couldn't be captured in test scores or reduced to policy violations. They were the real measure of education, the growth not just in knowledge, but in character. As the morning progressed, more news vans appeared on her street. She kept her curtains drawn, declining interviews. This wasn't about her, she told herself. It was about something bigger, about the daily choices teachers make, about the gap between policy and practice, about what it really means to put students first. What she didn't know yet was that among the thousands sharing her story, one viewer would change everything. A powerful media executive who recognized her son's school, who suddenly understood why he'd been doing so much better lately, and who was already setting wheels in motion that would transform this story of loss into something entirely unexpected. Elena Reynolds sat in her Manhattan office, staring at her phone in disbelief. The viral video of a teacher being fired in a small suburban middle school had caught her attention like so many other viewers, but for a very different reason. She recognized the school, she recognized the teacher's name, and most importantly, she recognized the student at the heart of the story, her own son, Marcus. The wall of monitors behind her desk displayed various news channels, all running some version of the story. Her assistant hovered nervously in the doorway, aware that something significant was unfolding, but unsure what to do about the tears in his normally unflappable boss's eyes. "Cancel my meetings for the next 2 days," Elena said, her voice steady, despite her emotion. "And get the jet ready, I'm going home." Home. The word felt strange in her mouth. She'd been so busy building her media empire, Reynolds Communications Group, that home had become a series of luxury hotel rooms and corporate apartments. Marcus lived in their suburban house with his aunt, while Elena managed the company from New York, London, Tokyo, wherever the next deal required her to be. She opened her laptop, pulling up Marcus's school records, something she should have done months ago. His grades had improved dramatically over the past semester. She'd attributed it to his natural intelligence, to the tutors she'd arranged, to his aunt's oversight. Now she knew better. "Mrs. Mitchell," she murmured, reading through the teacher's profile. 20 years of service, dozens of commendations, the kind of educator every parent hoped their child would have. And Elena had been too busy to even know her name until now. A message flashed on her screen. Her investigative team had already compiled a detailed report. Sarah Mitchell had spent over $500 of her own money on textbooks for Marcus. She'd been making him lunch every day. Most importantly, she'd given him something Elena hadn't been able to lately: time, attention, encouragement. The irony wasn't lost on Elena. She owned television networks, radio stations, digital platforms reaching millions. She'd built her company on the principle of connecting people, of sharing stories that mattered, yet she'd missed the most important story happening in her own son's life. She picked up a framed photo from her desk. Marcus, at age 7, missing. His front teeth grinning proudly beside her at a company event. When had she stopped attending his school functions? When had their nightly phone calls become quick texts and rushed conversations between meetings? Her computer chimed with another report. The GoFundMe for Sarah Mitchell had reached $50,000 and was still climbing. People around the country were sharing similar stories of teachers who'd gone above and beyond, often at personal cost. Elena stood, walking to the floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking Manhattan. She'd built her career on recognizing opportunities, on seeing the bigger picture. Now, staring at her reflection against the city skyline, she saw something else, a chance to make things right, not just for her son and his teacher, but for educators everywhere. "Get me everything you can on educational foundation structures," she told her assistant through the intercom, "and contact our PR team. I want a press conference arranged at Lincoln Middle School tomorrow morning." She paused, considering the magnitude of what she was planning. "And find out who's responsible for Sarah Mitchell's termination. I want to understand exactly how this happened." The answers came quickly. District policies designed to prevent liability issues. Administrators more concerned with following rules than achieving results. A system that somehow made it wrong for teachers to help students in need. Elena smiled, a familiar expression that had preceded many of her company's biggest moves. She'd built her empire by identifying broken systems and fixing them. Now she had the chance to do that in education, starting with one teacher and one school. She opened a new message on her phone, not to her corporate team or her PR department, but to Marcus. "Coming home tomorrow," she wrote. "I think it's time we had a talk about your teacher, Mrs. Mitchell." His response was immediate. "Mom, they fired her because of me, because she helped me. Can you do something?" Elena looked at the media empire she'd built, at the resources at her disposal, at the influence she wielded. "Yes," she replied. "I can do something, and I will." She pressed the intercom again. "Have the cars ready at the airport. Not just one, I want a fleet. It's time to make a statement." Tomorrow, Sarah Mitchell would learn that her small act of kindness hadn't just touched one student's life. It had reached all the way to a Manhattan penthouse and awakened something in a mother who had forgotten what really mattered. The morning sun glinted off a line of black limousines as they pulled into Lincoln Middle School's parking lot with choreographed precision. Students pressed against classroom windows, phones ready to record whatever was about to unfold. The small group of reporters who'd been camping out since yesterday suddenly snapped to attention, cameras swiveling toward the unexpected motorcade. Principal Walker stood at the top of the school steps, his usual composed demeanor slipping as after car arrived. The district superintendent had rushed over at the first call about the fleet of vehicles approaching the school, and now he stood nervously adjusting his tie. The door of the lead limousine opened, and Elena Reynolds emerged, every inch the media mogul in her tailored suit and confident stride. Those who recognized her gasped. Her face was familiar from magazine covers and television interviews, but her presence here seemed impossible, like seeing a movie star in a grocery store. "Mrs. Reynolds," the superintendent stepped forward, hand extended. "This is an unexpected, is it?" Elena's voice carried across the parking lot, perfectly modulated from years of public speaking. "I would think a parent's presence at her son's school should be the most expected thing in the world." She turned to face the growing crowd and the news cameras. "Though I admit, I haven't been here nearly enough lately." Marcus appeared at the school entrance, drawn by the commotion. Elena's professional mask softened as she saw her son. "Hello, sweetheart. I think it's time we had a family discussion about what's been happening here." The superintendent's face paled as recognition dawned. "Marcus Reynolds is my son." "Yes." Eleanor's smile didn't waver, but her eyes hardened slightly. "The student who needed basic textbooks and lunch, the one whose teacher was fired for providing them." She raised her voice to address the gathered crowd. "My son, who I thought was doing well because of expensive tutors, but who was actually thriving because one teacher cared enough to help him when I wasn't paying attention." More students and teachers had gathered now, including Mrs. Donovan, who watched with undisguised satisfaction. Phones recorded everything, broadcasting the scene live across social media platforms that Elena herself owned. "Where is Sarah Mitchell?" Elena asked, though she already knew the answer. Her team had informed her that Sarah hadn't left her house since the termination, avoiding the media circus her story had created. "Mrs. Mitchell is no longer employed," the superintendent began. "That's not what I asked." Elena's voice could have frozen summer. "I asked where the teacher is who did what I should have noticed needed doing, the one who saw my son was hungry and fed him, who realized he needed books and provided them, who did in fact exactly what we should want every teacher to do." Principal Walker stepped forward. "Mrs. Reynolds, there are district policies." "Oh yes, the policies." Elena turned to the cameras, knowing exactly how to play this moment. "Let's talk about those policies, the ones that make it wrong for teachers to help students in need, that punish educators for caring too much, that somehow make it against the rules to ensure every child has the tools they need to learn." She reached into her briefcase and withdrew a folder. I've spent the night reviewing these policies. Did you know that my company's legal team found 17 potential violations of educational equity laws in them? 17 ways these rules might actually be illegal. The superintendent's tie adjustment became more frantic. Elena pressed on, her voice carrying to the furthest corners of the crowd. But we're not here to discuss lawsuits. We're here to talk about something more important, about what happens when we let rules become more important than children. When we forget that education isn't just about policies and procedures, but about people who care enough to make a difference. She turned to Marcus, who stood watching with a mixture of awe and embarrassment. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I should have been paying more attention. But Mrs. Mitchell wasn't she? She saw what you needed, and she helped, not because it was her job, but because it was right." Elena faced the cameras again, her expression determined. "And now I'm going to do what's right too, starting with fixing the mistake that was made here." She glanced at her watch, then smiled. "In fact, I believe Mrs. Mitchell should be receiving a phone call right about now, one that I think will change everything, not just for her, but for every teacher who's ever had to choose between following rules and helping students." Sarah sat in her living room, still in her morning robe, staring at her phone as if it might bite. The caller ID displayed a number she didn't recognize, but the voicemail that had just arrived made her heart race. "Mrs. Mitchell, this is Elena Reynolds, CEO of Reynolds Communications Group and Marcus's mother. I'm at Lincoln Middle School right now, and I would very much like to speak with you. A car is already on its way to your house. Please let me make this right." Through her window, Sarah could see another sleek black limousine pulling up to her modest house. Her neighbor's curtains twitched with curiosity. After a moment's hesitation, she went to change into professional attire. The same outfit she'd worn on her first day of teaching, still classic and well-maintained. 20 minutes. Later, Sarah found herself walking up the familiar steps of Lincoln Middle School, but everything felt different. Students and teachers lined the hallways, breaking into spontaneous applause as she passed. Mrs. Donovan stepped forward to squeeze her hand, whispering, "Wait until you hear what's coming." The principal's office had been transformed into an impromptu conference room. Elena Reynolds stood as Sarah entered, and for a moment the two women simply looked at each other, the media mogul and the middle school teacher connected by one boy's education. "Mrs. Mitchell," Elena began, then stopped herself. "Sarah, thank you for coming. Please sit down." She gestured to a chair next to Marcus, who beamed at his teacher. Sarah sat, noting how the superintendent and Principal Walker seemed to have been relegated to the corners of the room. Elena commanded the space as only someone accustomed to running corporate boardrooms could. "First," Elena said, "I owe you an apology. As Marcus's mother, I should have been more aware, more involved. You stepped in to fill a gap I didn't even know existed, and for that, I am deeply grateful." "Marcus is a wonderful student," Sarah replied automatically, teacher's instincts kicking in. "He just needed the right tools to succeed." "Yes, the tools." Eleanor's expression hardened slightly as she glanced at the administrators. "Tools that should have been provided through proper channels, but weren't. Tools that you provided at personal cost, both financially and professionally." She opened a leather portfolio, removing a document. "But that's why I'm here, not just to apologize, but to propose a solution, one that could help not just Marcus, but every student who needs those tools." Elena handed the document to Sarah. "I'm establishing the Mitchell Reynolds Educational Foundation with an initial endowment of $50 million. Its mission will be to provide resources directly to teachers and students, bypassing the bureaucratic barriers that too often stand in their way." Sarah's hands trembled as she looked at the proposal. The figures were staggering, not just the endowment, but the planned scope of the foundation's work. "And," Elena continued, "I want you to run it." The room fell silent. Sarah looked up from the document, certain she'd misheard. "I'm sorry, what?" "I want you to be the foundation's executive director," Elena said firmly. You've demonstrated exactly the kind of judgment, compassion, and commitment we need. Who better to lead an organization dedicated to helping teachers help students than someone who risked everything to do exactly that? Sarah's mind raced. But I don't have experience running a foundation. You have 20 years of experience identifying students' needs and finding ways to meet them. That's exactly what this foundation will do, just on a larger scale. Elena smiled. And of course, you'll have a full staff to handle the administrative details. Your job will be to shape the vision, to ensure we stay true to the mission of helping students succeed. The superintendent cleared his throat. Mrs. Reynolds, while this is very generous, there are certain protocols. I think, Elena cut him off smoothly, we've established that the current protocols need serious revision. She turned back to Sarah. The foundation will work with schools across the district, eventually expanding nationwide. No teacher will ever again have to choose between helping a student and keeping their job. Sarah looked at Marcus, who nodded encouragingly. She thought of all the other students she'd seen struggling over the years, all the teachers she knew who dipped into their own pockets to help their classes. Can I still teach? She asked quietly. Elena's smile widened. I was hoping you'd ask that. The foundation will include a teaching academy demonstrating innovative approaches to education. You'll be able to teach while also training others to carry forward your methods. Sarah looked down at the proposal again, seeing not just numbers and plans, but possibilities. Possibilities for change, for improvement, for transformation. When do we start? She asked. Elena's eyes sparkled. We already have. Right now, in fact, there's a press conference waiting outside. Shall we go tell them about the future of education? 1 month later, Sarah stood in the newly renovated building that would house the Mitchell Reynolds Educational Foundation. The former community center had been transformed into a state-of-the-art learning facility, with classrooms, resource centers, and a teacher training wing. Floor-to-ceiling windows flooded the space with natural light, and the walls were already filling with student artwork. What do you think? Elena asked, joining her at the window. In the past weeks, they'd developed an easy rapport, two women united by their commitment to education and their fondness for Marcus, who'd become the foundation's unofficial mascot. It's amazing, Sarah replied, watching contractors install the sign above the main entrance, though I still think it should just be the Reynolds Foundation. Not a chance. Elena smiled. Your name belongs up there. You're the heart of this project. The Foundation's first initiative had already launched, a district-wide audit of student needs, followed by immediate provision of necessary supplies. No more teachers buying materials out of their own pockets, no more students going without textbooks or basic tools for learning. Sarah's old classroom at Lincoln Middle School had become a model for the Foundation's resource program. Every student now had access to new textbooks, proper supplies, and healthy lunches. More importantly, teachers had been empowered to identify and meet student needs without fear of repercussion. Mrs. Mitchell! A familiar voice called out. Marcus bounded through the front door, followed by a group of students from various district schools. They were part of the Foundation's Student Advisory Board, helping to ensure that programs truly met student needs. What do you think of the new science lab? Marcus asked eagerly. The facility included a fully equipped laboratory that would be available to all district schools, ensuring every student had access to proper equipment for experiments and research. It's perfect, Sarah smiled, remembering how Marcus had once struggled to copy diagrams from a borrowed textbook. Now, he was helping design programs to prevent other students from facing similar challenges. Elena's phone buzzed. Another media. Request for interviews. The story of the Foundation had captured national attention, sparking discussions about educational equity and teacher empowerment across the country. Other districts were already reaching out, hoping to replicate the model. The first teacher training session starts next week, Elena mentioned, reviewing her calendar. We've had over 300 applications for 50 spots. Sarah nodded, thinking of the carefully designed curriculum. They would teach not just educational techniques, but also how to identify student needs, how to access foundation resources, how to create supportive classroom environments where every child could thrive. The Foundation's legal team, the same. Ones who had found 17 violations in the district's old policies, had helped draft new guidelines that protected both teachers and students. No more Byzantine approval processes, no more choosing between rules and student welfare. Oh, and this came for you. Elena handed Sarah an envelope. Inside was a letter from Maria, her former student now in medical school. Enclosed was a check for the cost of the graphing calculator Sarah had bought her years ago. Please add this to the Foundation's funds, Maria wrote. Help another student the way you helped me. And thank you for showing us all what it really means to be a teacher. Sarah tucked the letter into her desk drawer, next to others she'd received from former students and fellow teachers. Each one reinforced her conviction that they were on the right path. A group of teachers arrived for a tour of the facility, including Mrs. Donovan and several others from Lincoln Middle School. The superintendent who had once fired Sarah now spoke enthusiastically about the district's partnership with the Foundation, though he tended to avoid direct eye contact with either Sarah or Elena. Ready to show them around? Elena asked, watching. Sarah's expression softened as she observed the teachers' reactions to the space. More than ready, Sarah replied. This was her favorite part, showing educators what was possible when barriers were removed and support was provided. Each wide-eyed look, each excited question about resources and programs reminded her of why they'd created the Foundation. As they began the tour, Sarah caught sight of the Foundation's mission statement, prominently displayed in the entrance hall. Every student deserves the tools to succeed. Every teacher deserves the support to help them. Below it hung a simple framed lunch bag, the first one she'd packed for Marcus, preserved as a reminder of how small acts of kindness could spark tremendous change. And here, Sarah told the visiting teachers, is where we begin to transform education. One student, one teacher, one school at a time. 6 months into the Foundation's operation, Sarah sat in her office, reviewing the latest impact report. The numbers told a story more powerful than she could have imagined. 3,000 students provided with supplies, 500 teachers, trained in the Foundation's methods, and test scores rising across the district. But the real victories were in the details, the individual stories that crossed her desk each day. Like Jenny Martinez, whose younger sister was now thriving in advanced placement classes, supported by Foundation resources. Or Mr. Phillips, who'd used Foundation funding to create a literacy program that had 4th graders reading at 6th grade levels. Each success validated their approach, proving that removing barriers to education could transform entire communities. You need to see this, Elena said, walking in without knocking, a habit she'd developed as their partnership deepened. She carried a tablet displaying a video from one of the Foundation's satellite programs in a neighboring district. The footage showed a classroom where every student had proper supplies, healthy food, and access to the latest educational technology. But what caught Sarah's attention was the teacher, a young woman who'd been through their training program. She used the same gentle encouragement, the same careful attention to individual needs that Sarah had always believed in. She reminds me of you, Elena commented, watching Sarah's expression. They all do, in a way. You've created a template for what teaching should be. Sarah shook her head. We've created it. Your resources, my experience, it's the combination that makes it work. A knock at the door interrupted them. Marcus entered, followed by a group of students from the Foundation's mentorship program. They'd paired high-achieving students with younger ones who needed support, creating a chain of helping that extended through all grade levels. Mom, Mrs. Mitchell? Marcus began, his confidence now a permanent fixture. "We have an idea for expanding the lunch program." The students laid out their proposal, a system for identifying food insecurity early before it affected academic performance. They'd thought of everything, from discrete distribution methods to nutritional guidelines. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, remembering the boy who'd once broken a single granola bar in half to share. Elena studied the proposal with her usual sharp business acumen. "This is excellent work. We'll implement it immediately." The Foundation's rapid response had become legendary in educational circles. No more endless committees or bureaucratic delays. When a need was identified, it was met, quickly, efficiently, and with dignity for all involved. Later that afternoon, Sarah led a teacher training session in the Foundation's main hall. The space was filled with educators from across the state, each eager to learn how to better serve their students. "The most important thing," she told them, "is to see the whole student. Not just test scores or completed assignments, but the child behind them. The one who might be hungry, might need glasses, might just need someone to believe in them." She shared her own story. Not just the part that had made headlines, but the 20 years before it. The countless small moments of choosing to help, of finding ways around obstacles, of believing that every child deserved a chance to succeed. "The Foundation isn't just about providing resources," she explained. "It's about changing how we think about education, about making it possible for every teacher to do what's right for their students without risking their careers." After the session, a young teacher approached her, eyes bright with purpose. "I have a student," she began hesitantly, "who reminds me so much of Marcus. Brilliant, hard-working, but struggling because of circumstances beyond his control." Sarah reached for the Foundation's resource request form, streamlined to a single page, designed for immediate action. "Tell me what he needs." By the end of the day, another student had the tools to succeed. Another teacher felt empowered to help, and another small victory had been added to the Foundation's growing legacy. Walking through the building that evening, Sarah paused at the wall of success stories, photos and letters from students and teachers whose lives had been changed by the Foundation's work. At the center was the original news story about her firing, now framed as a reminder of how adversity could lead to transformation. Elena joined her, 2 coffee cups in hand, thinking deep thoughts. "Just wondering what Mrs. Henderson would think." Sarah smiled, accepting the coffee. "My teacher, who bought me that calculator all those years ago. I wish she could see how her small act of kindness inspired all of this." "She can." Elena gestured to the bustling Foundation around them. "Every time a teacher helps a student, every time we break down another barrier to education, her legacy lives on, just like yours will." Outside, the sun was setting on another day of change, of progress, of transformation. But inside the Elena Reynolds Educational Foundation, the light of learning burned brighter than ever. 1 year to the day after Sarah's dismissal from Lincoln Middle School, she stood at the podium in the Foundation's main auditorium, addressing a packed house of educators, administrators, and students from across the country. The annual Elena Reynolds Education Summit had drawn participants from all 50 states, each eager to learn how to implement the Foundation's successful model in their own districts. "A year ago," Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly through the hall, "I thought my teaching career was over. Instead, I discovered it was just beginning, in ways I never could have imagined." In the front row, Marcus sat between his mother and Mrs. Donovan, who had become the Foundation's head of teacher development. He'd grown taller over the year, but what really stood out was his poise, the confident way he carried himself as one of the Foundation's student ambassadors. "What we've created here isn't just about providing resources," Sarah continued. "It's about changing the conversation around education, about asking not what rules we need to follow, but what students we need to help." The statistics displayed behind her told part of the story. Graduation rates up 15% across the district, teacher retention improved by 40%, student attendance at an all-time high. But the real success stories were in the faces before her, teachers who no longer had to choose between helping students and keeping their jobs, students who had all the tools they needed to succeed. During the break, Elena joined Sarah in her office, carrying a familiar-looking cardboard box. "Look what the renovation crew found behind a cabinet in your old classroom." Sarah opened the box to find her old class photos, the ones she'd packed away that difficult day a year ago. But now they represented something different, not an ending, but a beginning. Each face in those photos reminded her of why they'd created the foundation. "We've had requests from 30 more districts to implement our program," Elena said, reviewing the latest reports on her tablet. "The governor called this morning. They want to make our model the state standard." Sarah smiled, remembering the superintendent's initial resistance. Now he was one of their strongest advocates, touring other districts to explain how the foundation had transformed education in their community. A knock at the door interrupted them. Mrs. Peterson, the English teacher who had first reported Sarah's help to Marcus, stood nervously in the doorway. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said. "I wanted to apologize. What I did last year, I was wrong." "Come in," Sarah said warmly. "Tell me about your students." Over the next hour, Mrs. Peterson shared her own struggles with helping students in need, the frustration of working within restrictive policies, the fear of losing her job. By the end of the conversation, she had become the newest participant in the Foundation's teacher training program. Later that afternoon, Sarah led a workshop on identifying student needs, using her experience with Marcus as a case study. But now the story had a different ending. Instead of punishment for helping, teachers learned about the Foundation's rapid response system, designed to provide immediate assistance while protecting both educators and students. "Remember," she told the assembled teachers, "you're not alone anymore. When you see a student in need, you don't have to choose between your conscience and your career." The day concluded with a special ceremony in the Foundation's main hall. One by one, students came forward to share how the program had changed their lives. A young girl who'd received her first pair of glasses through the Foundation's health initiative. A boy who'd discovered a passion for science in the new laboratory. Each story added another thread to the tapestry of transformation they were weaving. Marcus was the last to speak. He stood at the podium, poised and articulate, so different from the hungry boy copying textbook pages a year ago. "Mrs. Mitchell taught me more than math," he said. "She taught me that one person's kindness can change everything, that doing what's right matters more than doing what's easy. And now, through this foundation, she's teaching that lesson to everyone." As applause filled the hall, Sarah felt Elena's hand squeeze her shoulder. They'd done more than create a foundation, they'd started a movement. Across the country, other organizations were following their model, other donors were stepping forward, other teachers were finding ways to help without fear. The day ended with a quiet moment in Sarah's office. She was adding a new photo to her wall. This one showing the Foundation's first graduating class, students who'd been supported from middle school through high school. In the center was Marcus, his smile bright with promise. A note from one of the graduating students caught her eye. "Thank you for showing us that sometimes the best lessons aren't found in textbooks, but in the example of someone who refuses to stop caring." 5 years after its founding, the Mitchell Reynolds Educational Foundation had become a beacon of hope in American education. Sarah sat in the Foundation's expanded headquarters, reviewing a stack of thank you letters from students whose lives had been touched by their programs. Each one told a story of transformation, of barriers overcome, of potential realized. The Foundation now operated in 50 states, with satellite offices in every major city. What had started as a response to one teacher helping one student had grown into a nationwide movement, changing how America thought about education and student support. Remember this? Elena walked in, holding a faded newspaper clipping, the original story about Sarah's firing. They kept it framed in the Foundation's museum, along with Marcus's old textbooks and that first packed lunch bag, reminders of where it all began. Seems like another lifetime, Sarah replied, glancing out her window at the teaching academy next door, where hundreds of educators learn to implement the Foundation's methods each year. Did you see the latest data from the Department of Education? Elena nodded proudly. Districts using our model show a 90% reduction in student resource gaps, teacher retention up 60% nationwide. And the best part, other foundations are following our lead. The ripple effect had been remarkable. Major corporations, inspired by Elena's example, had started their own educational initiatives. State legislatures had revised outdated policies, replacing punitive measures with supportive frameworks. The conversation around education had shifted from bureaucracy to compassion. Marcus, now in his first year of college studying education policy, had become a sought-after speaker on educational reform. His story, and Sarah's, had inspired a generation of future teachers who believed in the power of individual action to create systemic change. A knock at the door interrupted their reminiscence. Mrs. Donovan entered with a group of international educators, here to study the Foundation's methods. The program had gone global, with delegations from countries around the world seeking to replicate its success. And this, Mrs. Donovan was saying, is where it all started. Sarah Mitchell and Elena Reynolds showed us that when we remove barriers to education, when we support teachers in supporting students, remarkable things happen. Sarah stood to greet the visitors, but paused at a familiar face in the doorway. Jenny Martinez, the student who had once asked why she was leaving Lincoln Middle School. Now she was a first-year teacher herself, participating in the Foundation's mentorship program. "My students wanted you to have these," Jenny said, presenting a bundle of letters. "They're studying the Foundation's history, and each one wrote about how your story inspired them." Sarah opened one letter, written in careful middle school handwriting. "Dear Mrs. Mitchell, before the Foundation helped my family, I was embarrassed about not having school supplies. Now I know that asking for help isn't shameful. It's brave. Thank you for teaching us that lesson." Elena watched Sarah read the letters, remembering their conversation from years ago about making a difference, one student at a time. They'd done that and more, creating a system where no teacher had to risk their career to help a child in need, where no student had to go without basic educational tools. The Foundation's latest initiative was perhaps its most ambitious yet, a complete reimagining of educational policy at the national level. They were working with Congress to draft legislation that would institutionalize their approach, ensuring that future generations of students would have built-in support systems. "We've got the Governor's Education Summit next week," Elena reminded Sarah, checking her calendar. "They want to discuss implementing our models statewide. And the new teacher training center opens Tuesday," Sarah added. The center would be named after Mrs. Henderson, her own teacher who had bought her that life-changing calculator years ago. The legacy of caring, of quiet assistance, of believing in students' potential lived on. Later that afternoon, Sarah led a training session for new Foundation staff. Looking out at their eager faces, she saw the future of education, people committed to removing barriers, supporting growth, and believing in the power of compassion to change lives. "Every morning," she told them, "I read the letters we receive from students and teachers across the country. Each one reminds me of why we do this work. Because education isn't just about textbooks and test scores. It's about seeing each student as a person worthy of investment, of belief, of support." On her desk sat a recent photo of the Foundation's leadership team. Elena and Sarah stood in the center, flanked by educators from across the country. But Sarah's eyes were drawn to the students in the front row, each one representing a story of possibility, of potential unleashed, of barriers overcome. The Elena Reynolds Educational Foundation had become more than an organization. It was a testament to the power of one small act of kindness to spark a revolution that proved once and for all that doing the right thing could indeed change the world. On a crisp autumn morning, much like the day she'd first noticed Marcus copying textbook pages, Sarah stood in her old classroom at Lincoln Middle School. The room had changed. New technology on the walls, fresh paint, updated furniture, all provided by the foundation. But the essence remained the same, a space where learning could flourish, where every student had a chance to succeed. She was there for a special ceremony. The school board had voted unanimously to rename the building the Sarah Mitchell Learning Center, though she'd tried to talk them out of it. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same institution that had once fired her was now honoring her legacy. Marcus, home from college for the occasion, stood at the podium addressing the gathered crowd. He'd grown into a poised young man, his early struggles transformed into a powerful drive to help others. 10 years ago, I sat in this classroom, hungry and embarrassed, trying to copy textbook pages because I couldn't afford my own, he said. But Mrs. Mitchell saw more than a struggling student. She saw potential. She saw worth. And in seeing that, she changed not just my life, but the lives of countless students across the country. Elena sat in the front row, her media empire now increasingly focused on educational initiatives. The partnership she and Sarah had formed had grown into something neither could have imagined. That day, the Limousines arrived at Lincoln Middle School. The foundation's work continued to expand, but its heart remained the same, the simple belief that every student deserved the tools to learn and every teacher deserved the freedom to help. What had started with a packed lunch and borrowed textbooks had become a movement that transformed American education. As Sarah looked out at the faces before her, teachers, students, administrators, all part of the foundation's extended family, she remembered Mrs. Henderson and that long-ago calculator. How one act of kindness could ripple outward, touching lives far beyond its original reach. The ceremony concluded with the unveiling of a plaque in the school's entrance. But it wasn't Sarah's name that brought tears to her eyes. It was the quote beneath it, words she'd spoken that difficult day when she'd packed up her classroom. Teaching isn't just a job, it's who we are, and sometimes doing what's right matters more than following the rules. Marcus joined her as the crowd dispersed, his mother close behind. 3 lives intertwined by circumstance, transformed by choice, united by purpose. "Ready for the next chapter?" he asked with a smile. Sarah touched the plaque gently, thinking of all the teachers and students yet to come, all the lives yet to be changed. "Always," she replied. "There's still so much work to do." And in classrooms across the country, teachers opened supply closets. Stocked by the foundation, students learned with proper tools and full stomachs, and the quiet revolution of compassion continued. One student, one teacher, one moment of kindness at a time.